Alright, so before we get into the video here, I just want to give a quick shout out to the boys at the Vanguard, Zach and Gavin. We are currently in the midst of doing sort of a weekly running book club, where right now we're covering Palestine, a socialist introduction. So if you want to go hear us talk about that and the history of Israel, the history of Palestine, then make sure to tune into that tonight. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get into it. So Congress is back at it again. Okay, are we giving healthcare to the American people? Are we giving living wages to the American people? Are we giving, free higher level education to the American people, or anything even remotely helpful? No, absolutely not. We are continuing to funnel billions on top of the already billions that we give to the government of Israel to conduct a massacre in Gaza and the ongoing displacement of Palestinians in the West Bank, as well as going out of our way apparently to censure the only Palestinian American member of Congress right now. So here from the AP. House votes to censure Representative Rashida Tlaib over her Israel-Hamas rhetoric in a stunning rebuke. Already, I kind of have an issue with this headline here, because this isn't about Israel versus Hamas rhetoric. We're talking about Israel versus Palestinians rhetoric. Okay, that's what she was referencing here. This headline even kind of gives the implication that she was coming out and tweeting like, "Let's go Hamas, kill more Israeli babies," or something like that, when that's the complete opposite of everything that she said. But a little bit of details here. They say, the House of Representatives voted late Tuesday to censure Democratic Representative Rashida Tlaib of Michigan, the only Palestinian American in Congress, an extraordinary rebuke of her rhetoric about the Israel-Hamas war. It's not an Israel-Hamas war, it's an Israeli massacre of vastly disproportionately a wide majority of Palestinian civilians within Gaza. Okay, that's what the data is showing us right now. This isn't Israel versus Hamas, as if it's like two equal militaries just valiantly battling it out. No, you're killing a vast majority innocent civilians. Let's be honest about that, right? Okay, but in addition to that, I also want to point out here, right? She's from Michigan, okay? So on top of her being the only Palestinian, member of Congress in the United States of America, she's also from a key state here in the US. Now, we've seen Joe Biden's polling data fall off of an absolute cliff over the last couple of weeks with Palestinian, or with Arab Americans, okay, to be specific. And that comes especially into play in a state like Michigan that does have a substantial Arab American population and a Palestinian American population there. Okay, so this is also important not just in like the moral sense or the humanitarian sense, but it's also important in the political sense from Joe Biden, that he wins a state like Michigan and he's doing absolutely no favors to himself on that front for 2024 with his current endorsement of everything that Israel wants to do. But they continue saying that the 234 to 188 tally came after enough Democrats joined with Republicans to censure Tlaib, a punishment one step below expulsion from the House. The three-term congresswoman has been a target of criticism for her views on the decades-long conflict in the Middle East. They say the debate on the censure resolution on Tuesday afternoon was emotional and intense. Republican Representative Rich McCormick, unfortunately from my home state of Georgia, pushed the measure in response to what he called Tlaib's promotion of anti-Semitic rhetoric, and he said that she has, quote, levied unbelievable falsehoods about our greatest ally, Israel, and the attack on October 7th. Okay, now, I mean, keep in mind, look at what he's saying here, right? Levied unbelievable falsehoods, okay? I would imagine the falsehoods that he's talking about is that she's critical of the absolute verifiable fact that Israel is an apartheid state and that they're doing an ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. So that would be, I guess, his version of an unbelievable falsehood, okay? Our greatest ally, Israel, and the attack on October 7th. Now, did Rashida Tlaib come out and say that there were no atrocities committed on October 7th, or that Hamas was justified in every single thing that they did on October 7th in killing some Israeli civilians? Did she come out and say that? No, she didn't. In fact, she came out and condemned Hamas killing innocent Israeli civilians. But you would get the impression from a quote like this, from the guy who brought this censure resolution, that she's somehow like openly pro-Hamas, and that's just absolutely not the case. But they continue. With other Democrats standing by her side, other members of the squad to be specific, Tlaib defended her stance, saying that she will not be silenced and I will not let you distort my words. She added that a criticism of Israel, or her criticism of Israel, has always been directed towards its government and its leadership under Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. So we have this continued conflation of a criticism of the government of Israel, the leadership structure of Israel, the policies of Israel, and conflating that with all Jewish people around the world. If you have a critique of Benjamin Netanyahu, then you must hate Jewish people. If you have a critique of the settler colonial project of Zionism, then you must be a hater of the Jews. I mean, it's just completely absurd. She continued, quote, "It is important to separate people and government. The idea that criticizing the government of Israel is anti-Semitic sets a very dangerous precedent, and it's been used to silence diverse voices speaking up for human rights across our nation." She's 100% correct there. They say all Democrats initially stood by Tlaib and helped defeat the first, so this was multiple censure resolutions here, that was against her last week. But since then, many of her colleagues, including prominent Jewish members, have become more conflicted about her rhetoric about the war, especially because of a slogan that she used frequently that is widely seen as a call for the eradication of Israel. Okay, and they finish off here, or we finish off here. Ultimately, more than 20 Democrats joined with Republicans on Tuesday night to censure her in an effort after the initial one failed earlier in the day. Okay, so I want to touch on something here, right? The slogan that they're referencing here is "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." Okay, and I don't even think that she personally tweeted this. I think that she retweeted a video that had chants of other people saying that. But even if she did tweet "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," okay, there's this incredible amount of controversy over this phrase that's happening right now in the United States, which, number one, before I get into what that phrase actually means to everybody that I've talked to about it, okay, I want to just mention that even us just having to spend the time talking about what this phrase means to people, okay, is distracting, intentionally distracting from Israel's actions in Gaza right now. Our government, our Congress, is spending their time censuring the only Palestinian American member of Congress right now, instead of talking about the widespread, indiscriminate massacre of Palestinian civilians within Gaza and also within the West Bank, as we have seen a dramatic uptick of the settler terrorism that is backed by the IDF and the government of Israel in the West Bank against Palestinians living there. So this entire conversation that we're having to have right now about this "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free" slogan is a distraction from what's actually happening on the ground, the suffering of Palestinian people in Gaza right now. And I think that in and of itself is completely fucking absurd, that you would even spend the time to go through this fucking procedural motion to censure her over this slogan. So now, let's get into that. From the river to the sea. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about from the Jordan River, right, which is on the border of where the West Bank is in the east to the east of Israel, right? From the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, which is on the west coast of Israel, in the the border with the Mediterranean Sea, Palestine will be free. So there's a couple different ways that you could interpret this. You can interpret this in the way that I think that I've seen a vast majority of Palestinians use it, and a vast majority of advocates and people who speak up for Palestinian rights, that they have used it, which is that from the river to the sea, between this area that we call Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza, Palestinians will be able to live with full democratic and civil rights. That Palestinians in this region, whether it's in Israel proper, whether it's in the West Bank, whether it's in the Gaza Strip, will be free, will have full rights, will be able to live their lives in dignity with self-determination, okay, and will be not subjected to an apartheid state, to a slow-rolling ethnic cleansing, and to endless war crimes, okay? That's what it means to me. That's what it means to a vast majority of the people that I talk to. That's what it means to Rashida Tlaib, as she has explicitly outlined in public multiple times before, okay? Now, another way you could interpret that is anybody who says "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free" means that they want to kill all Jews, okay? This is the other thing, right? And I want to touch on something that they said earlier in this article, because I think that it's an important point to make out here, right? Okay, so let's go ahead and go up here, right? When we're talking about the government of Israel, because there are many different, as they point out here, there are many different interpretations that have been levied here, especially by some, right-wing Democrats who are, pro-Zionism, and many Republicans as well, that it is widely seen as calling for the eradication of Israel. Now, this is an important part here, right? The eradication of Israel. What do we mean by that, right? When people come out and they say, well, Israel has a right to exist, what does that really mean? Okay, now I want to make this explicitly clear here from my perspective, right? Does Israel have a right to exist at a fundamental level? Well, it depends on what you mean by that. Does Israel have a right to exist as an apartheid state? that commits war crimes, that is conducting a slow-rolling ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people? If that's the question, if the question is, does Israel have a right to exist in its current formation, then the answer to that, in my opinion, would be no, it doesn't. No government, no nation state, no country has a right to engage in that kind of behavior. Now, if the question is, does Israel have a right to exist where everybody living within inside Israel has full democratic and civil rights, well, then that's a different question, of course. But if you're going to say, does Israel have a right to exist in the sense that, does Israel have a right to create an ethno-state, to displace hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Palestinians from their land, to massacre them with absolute impunity, then the answer would be no. I mean, it's the same thing. I mean, it's a completely arbitrary standard that we're talking about here. It would be the same thing as saying, well, does Germany have a right to exist? Well, I believe that, people have fundamental rights. I believe that individual human beings have fundamental protections that should be awarded to them. I believe that, sure, if you want to say like the Germanic people have a right to sovereignty and they have a right to all of the, guaranteed fundamental human rights that should be guaranteed to people across the world, then sure, Germany has a right to exist. But does Germany have a right to exist as a Nazi state? I would argue no. If they're conducting a Holocaust of the Jewish people, if they're committing widespread war crimes and an ethnic cleansing or an extermination campaign, well then, no, they don't have a right to exist under that formation. So you see how this question of like, does Israel have a right to exist is kind of just like nonsensical at face value. It's not about whether Israel has a right to exist or not. It's not about, is this phrase calling for an eradication of Israel? It's about what are the rights of the people who live in this region? Okay, how could we move forward with an adequate path towards peace for everybody living in the region? Not an ethno-state that displaces hundreds of thousands of people, that kills people with impunity, that is engaging in an objective apartheid state. That's not the real question here. The question is, where do we go from here? And so that's something that really bothers me about, this so-called from the river to the sea being like an eradication of the state of Israel. Well, what do you mean by the state of Israel? What do you mean by Israel has a right to exist? Because I don't believe that Israel has a right to exist if what you mean by that is they have a right to all of those different crimes that we just talked about here. But let's go ahead and hear directly from Rashida Tlaib herself. Okay, so this was her giving a very impassioned and emotional speech in front of Congress as this censure resolution was coming up. Let's hear directly from Rashida herself.
I can't believe I have to say this, but Palestinian people are not disposable. We are human beings, just like anyone else. My city, my grandmother, like all Palestinians, just wants to live her life with freedom and human dignity we all deserve. Speaking up to save lives, Mr. Chair, no matter faith, no matter ethnicity, should not be controversial in this chamber. The cries of the Palestinian and Israeli children sound no different to me. Why? What I don't understand is why the cries of Palestinians sound different to you all. 71% of Michigan Democrats support a ceasefire. So you can try to censure me, but you can't silence their voices. I urge my colleagues to join with the majority of Americans and support a ceasefire now to save as many lives as possible. President Biden must listen to and represent all of us, not just some of us. I urge the president to have the courage to call for a ceasefire and the end of killings.
Okay, so again, what she's calling for there, a ceasefire, what she's calling for there, a recognition that Palestinians should be treated with the same dignity that any human being should be treated with, I don't think is controversial. And I don't think that a vast majority of the American people, as she just pointed out, there are over 70% of her own constituents supporting the ceasefire. I don't think that it's controversial to the vast majority of this country, okay? And yet, we have a government led by Joe Biden. We have a government led by Republicans and Democrats in the House of Representatives and the Senate that basically view that as like anti-Semitism, that view that as completely out of the question. I mean, even some guys who I previously had some degree of respect for, right? You know, guys like John Fetterman saying that, you know, calls for a ceasefire are completely unacceptable. You know, people like Karine Jean-Pierre, who I really never had respect for, but, you know, saying that calls for a ceasefire or protests against Israel are repugnant and disgraceful. You know, I mean, this is our government right here, right? And so we've talked about some of the abhorrent and disgusting comments that we've gotten from Republicans, but it also applies to many Democrats as well. I mean, you look at the people who are standing behind Rashida Tlaib right now. I mean, you got Cori Bush, Ayanna Pressley, Summer Lee, and Ilhan Omar, and Pramila Jayapal over here. But, you know, for the most part, you know, she's kind of left hanging out on her own. In terms of the actual policies that she is standing up for. And it's incredibly ironic because her calling for a ceasefire is something that is representative of what the vast majority of the American people want. Okay? Vast majority of Democrats, independents, Republicans all support a ceasefire right now in Gaza. And yet we only have a handful of members of Congress, like the people who are sitting in this picture right now, who have the balls, metaphorically obviously, to come out and to call for that, right? And so I wanted to also watch this. This was Ilhan Omar's speech. And this was very intense, very impassioned, a lot of energy here. So I just want to watch through this here as well.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is glaring hypocrisy when you have Republicans on the other side of the aisle trying to create definitions and say Rashida wants to annihilate people, when Max Miller himself went on TV and said we're turning Gaza into a parking lot and we want to annihilate Palestinians. Nobody condemned him on that side of the aisle. What is true here is that every single one of them has not acknowledged the fact that Palestinians are dying in the tens of thousands, but will continue to say it is us who are not acknowledging humanity. Rashida will stand strong.
Gentlelady's time has expired.
The movement will continue for liberation until every single
Gentlelady's time has expired.
Has the right to
Gentleman
live
from
in
Maryland
liberty.
is recognized.
Okay, so I mean, again, she's 100% right there to call out the hypocrisy. And, you know, I was going to play this clip of Chip Roy, but I honestly don't even think it's worth it. This motherfucker's not worth listening to here for a single goddamn second. But I do want to touch on some of the statements that we have gotten from Republicans in Congress about the Palestinian people, okay, versus, you know, Rashida Tlaib being censured for saying, like, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, right? Because I think that's another important point there. But just to touch on one other thing that Ilhan Omar pointed out there, right? I do think that it's incredibly ironic that we have a government right now, and I'm basing some of this on some of the recent posts that we've gotten from the government of Israel themselves on Twitter, on X.com, whatever the fuck you want to call it. There was a recent post that Israel dropped, right, where they basically published the names of everybody, all the 1,400 roughly Israelis who were killed on October 7th during that Hamas attack. And if you look at the names, and there's some dispute around this, but if you look at the names, it looks like roughly half of them, or about half of them, were members of the IDF. They had sergeant in front of their name, they had lieutenant in front of their name, they had commander in front of their name, whatever the case may be. And I genuinely do believe this, and maybe this is a controversial take here at this point, but based on what we've seen so far, with the casualties in Gaza, with the amount of civilians and children that have been killed in Gaza versus the amount of verified Hamas members that we've seen killed in Gaza during this Israeli bombardment. And then you compare that to the Hamas attack on October 7th. Now, I don't condone Hamas killing civilians, obviously, in any way, shape, or form. I think that's wrong. I think that's a war crime. I think that's horrendous. But I genuinely do think that when we get to the end of this, if we were to get firm lists on everybody who was killed, combatant versus civilian, that Hamas, proportionately, as a percentage, killed less civilians than Israel is and has been over the last month or so. Okay? And I don't say that to say, well, Hamas is better than Israel. I say that to say, look at the difference in the rhetoric versus how American Israeli politicians, right? Okay, Americans and Israeli politicians talk about the Hamas attack on October 7th. They say, this is the most barbaric and horrific and horrendous attack, terror attack, that we have ever seen. This is essentially, basically the equivalent of like a Holocaust 2.0. That's what's on the horizon for Israel, a Holocaust 2.0 by Hamas. So they frame it as if this is the worst thing that has ever happened. okay? And then look at how they talk about Israel's bombing of Gaza, where they have killed not only in a total number far more civilians than Hamas did on October 7th, but also arguably, according to the data we know right now, a larger percent of civilians than Hamas did. Because Hamas also, they did attack civilians, obviously, that's verifiable, but they did also attack military installations. And so I think the data that we have right now shows us that, if anything, if you're going to make those arguments about Hamas being brutal, which I would agree with to a large extent, right, then you have to make that same argument about the government of Israel. What do you say when we have, like 60 Hamas members confirmed killed at this point versus over 10,000 Palestinians killed? Over 4,000, at least, children in Gaza have been killed? So if you call Hamas barbaric, if you call them the terrorists, then what do you call Israel? Oh, you turn around and you say they're engaging in self-defense, right? They're just targeting Hamas. These are targeted bombing campaigns. Oops, maybe we killed some civilians along the way. Sorry, that's the price of war. Sorry, it's bloody, it's ugly, as John Kirby said. I mean, it's important to understand that, right? And then also look at the language difference, right? This is one example. This was, I believe, Max Miller, okay, from Ohio. This is how he talked about the Palestinian people.
Rashida Tlaib has I don't even want to call it the Palestinian flag because they're not a state, they're a territory that's about to probably get eviscerated and go away here shortly, as we're going to turn that into a parking lot.
We're going to turn Gaza, a population of 2.2 million people, half of whom are children, into a parking lot. Did this guy get censured? Did this guy get screamed at by fellow members of Congress as being Islamophobic or racist against the Palestinian people? No, of course not. If anything, he gets a pat on the back. He gets some fucking applause. Okay, we also had some of these examples, right? GOP Congressman Brian Mast, who we talked about as being sort of like a fraud IDF member, right? He's not even Jewish, he's not even Israeli, but he like volunteered for the IDF for a little portion of his life, whatever. Wore that IDF uniform into Congress, a uniform of a foreign country's military into the halls of Congress. I'm not like a nationalist, I'm not like an American patriot or whatever the fuck, but I think that's bizarre behavior to wear a different country's military uniform into the halls of Congress. But anyways, that's who Brian Mast is, Republican from Florida. He said every Palestinian civilian is a Nazi and should be treated as such. Senator Lindsey Graham said that we should level Gaza, okay, and bounce the rubble. That's what he said. But somehow, Rashida Tlaib is the one that's getting censured. We also had some sort of bizarre justification here from Richie Torres, one of my least favorite Democrats, especially recently. He said, I voted for the censure resolution calling for an end to Israel as a Jewish state through the insidious phrase, insidious, from the river to the sea, crosses a line of hate speech that no public official should ever cross. Congress has a right to take a principled stance against hate speech calling for the destruction of the world's only Jewish state. So a couple points I want to make here before I finish off this video, right? Number one, if you look at the history of the establishment of Israel as a Jewish state, it was never done out of the goodness of the hearts of Western Europeans, okay, or the United States of America for that matter. It was never done because they felt bad for the Holocaust, okay? That may be some of the reason. The vast majority of the reason, if you look at the Balfour Declaration in 1917, if you look at guys like Winston Churchill, if you look at the rhetoric of other Western Europeans, if you look at even the rhetoric of some of the earliest Zionists, okay, who established the state of Israel, okay, this was largely done because a lot of Western Europeans had an issue with anti-Semitism. And there's this like bizarre phenomenon here in some of the rhetoric that's used by US and European politicians, where they say, like, Israel is the only safe place for Jews. I heard Joe Biden say that just a couple days ago, right? Or a couple weeks ago. He said, like, I'm paraphrasing here, but he said it roughly like, if it wasn't for Israel, Jews wouldn't be safe anywhere around the world. Why is that? Why is that the case? Because I do believe anti-Semitism is an issue. I believe it's an issue that needs to be firmly and aggressively fought against. You know who the biggest anti-Semites are? The people on the far right. The neo-Nazis, okay, the fascists. That's the threat to the Jewish people. It's not people who are standing up for Palestinian human rights and against apartheid and against ethnic cleansing. And I think that it's important that people recognize, like, creating an ethno-state as a safe place for the Jewish people, okay, I think first and foremost the focus should be on making it a safe place for Jewish people everywhere. In Western European countries, Germany, France, the UK, and over here in the United States as well. Jewish people, same as Palestinian people, deserve to live with full democratic, civil, human rights anywhere that they want to live in any of these different countries, right? And I think that when we have this conversation, like Richie Torres was just saying there, about the abolishment of Israel as a Jewish state, I think that it's important to recognize what that actually means. It's not as if the government of Israel, the state of Israel, was created out of thin air. It's not as if they walked into a desert where nobody was living and just like created a country, okay? There were people living there. When you talk about the creation of Israel as a Jewish state, when you talk about it being an exclusionary ethno-state, what you're talking about is the inherently including of an apartheid and an ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people. That's what you're referencing. And so again, circling back to this question of like, does Israel have a right to exist? Well, sure. If that means it's an actual democracy and that Palestinians who are living in this region under Israeli occupation right now and in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Israel proper, if what you mean by does Israel have a right to exist, that you mean everybody is going to be granted those rights and treated equally, regardless of their ethnicity, regardless of their race, regardless of their heritage, regardless of their religion, then yes, of course Israel has a right to exist. And of course, Jewish people all around the world deserve to live in dignity and respect, wherever they happen to be, okay, especially here in the United States. But if your question is, does Israel have a right to exist as an apartheid, as an ethnic cleansing power, okay, as a sort of like base for the American empire in the Middle East, then the answer to that, in my opinion, would be obviously no. And so anyways, I mean, I think that this conversation about Rashida Tlaib being censured is a despicable and disappointing waste of time. I think that it's largely based on sort of racist ideas about Muslims in this country. The idea that Rashida Tlaib wants to eradicate the Jewish people is patently absurd at face value if you just listen to what she said about this issue. And I think that people like Ilhan Omar, people like Cori Bush, people like Jamal Bowman, people like Rashida Tlaib, obviously, and Ayanna Pressley and Summer Lee, these are some of the only people with a spine in our entire government. These are some of the only people who are willing to listen to the human rights organizations, some of the only people who are willing to give an honest critique of one of our only allies in this region, okay, a country that we decide to prop up and to arm, and they are willing to put their careers on the line to stand up for what's right. And, obviously I don't agree with them on everything. I don't agree with them on all of their strategies and everything. But, this is one of those issues where it's like, man, there really is a difference. There is a difference between the sliver of a handful of members of Congress in like the so-called squad versus the rest of the Democratic and the Republican Party. And to everybody else in the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, who is full-throatedly supporting this and who is smearing anybody who has a critique of the actions of the government of Israel, fuck you, and you have massive amounts of blood on your hands right now.
Everyone is saying good politic guy has the best politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying